All right, now let's talk money. Nigeria recorded a fiscal deficit of 7.5 trillion naira in 2022, according to the latest data from the nation's budget office. The deficit, which has expanded every year since 2015, is another sign of the tough task ahead of Nigeria's new finance minister, Wale Edun. The government had budgeted a revenue of 9 trillion naira and a deficit of 5.2 trillion naira. However, according to data obtained from the 2022 Budget Implementation Report released by the Budget Office, the federal government of Nigeria ended 2022 with a fiscal deficit of 7.5 trillion naira, or 129% of the actual revenue collected. This implies that Nigeria is in a financial crisis as it continually struggles to balance its budgets. Well, to help us better understand these issues, Vincent Oshoma, Head Equity Trading, Interstate Securities and Mutual Funds Limited, joins us virtually. Good morning and thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's begin with this sad trend showing that Nigeria ended 2022 with a fiscal deficit of 7.5 trillion naira. That's 129% of the actual revenue collected. Does this raise any red flag for you?
Well, in some way, not really, because if you look at previous performance, it's the government, if you look at previous, even 2021, the revenue projection has always been far higher than the actual. So I think the government keeps setting the revenue projection far higher than what it actually gets to collect.
Oh.
So that's why we continue to see that variation in terms of projection. And also, the government have been operating a deficit budget, and this is some of the issues that have been raised, that have been talked about. The fact that we keep having a huge deficit which have to be funded with borrowing mainly, and that continue to have effect on our market and also in terms of fiscal position of the government.
So you were already expecting this huge deficit. It's not a surprise to you?
It's not really a surprise, because if you look at the previous years, that has been the trend whereby we see projection. You get to see projection. The revenue of the government has always been around 5 trillion naira every year, 5 to something trillion. So they continue to have a projection of 7-point-something trillion, and the recent one was about 9-point-something trillion. That tells you they continue to have projections that far above the actual revenue collected. And I think sometimes it's based on maybe some of the plans they have, but we have not seen those plans being materialized. Rather we have seen a continuous depreciation, deterioration in terms of the fiscal position. And then when you look at one of the major revenue stream for the government in terms of oil, when you look at the projection for oil in terms of amount of barrel per day, we are below in terms of the projection. Those are some of the factors that always affect the revenue projection of the government. So unless those things are, you see improvement in those areas, like we are seeing this year, we will not really to continue to fall below the projection for oil. Definitely, it will affect the revenue projection for the year.
Yeah, maybe not surprising, as you say, but isn't it disturbing that the nation's deficit has expanded every year since 2015? And of course, there have been different talks about how the projection has not been realistic. But shouldn't this be a source of concern?
Sorry, I didn't get that. Come again.
I said, yes, you've mentioned the fact that it's not surprising, especially looking at the fact that the federal government, projected a revenue that was far higher than what is realistic. But we've seen the deficits, budget deficit, expanding every year since 2015. Shouldn't this be a source of concern?
Yes, it's a major source of concern. Like I talked about earlier on, it's a major source of concern in the sense that when we continue to have these huge deficits, and the major source of funding this deficit is from borrowing. And one of the areas the government have used in borrowing, the area of borrowing that government used to fund the budget, the deficit, is through the ways and means, which was recently securitized and turned into a zero coupon bond. So these were one of the major areas because the government was not able to borrow in the open market. And it also means that in borrowing in the open market is carving out the businesses in the open market, which we continue to have effect. That is where there is a major concern, whereby the government is going to see a deficit. And when you look at the revenue instrument, even the capital project, a lot of this deficit is going to be spent on recurrent expenditure. One good thing that has happened is that's why the removal of subsidy is something that a lot of persons celebrated, though people have issues with the way is being implemented. That's the fact that it's going to reduce that deficit. When you look at the subsidy cost for the year, and the fact that burden has been removed of the government, that means it will definitely reduce the government deficit in terms of budget. But the subsidy was not factored in terms of full year subsidy was not factored when the budget for this year was being crafted. But that means going forward, it makes the fiscal position of the government better. And if the government is also able to look in and reduce costs in other areas, I think it will help in reducing the deficit because, like you mentioned, it's a source of concern. The huge deficit, when you look at the budget, the huge deficit is a source of concern to everybody.
Well, the data from the Budget Office reveals that the federal government received a total revenue of 5.8 trillion naira, which is a decline from 6.7 trillion naira received in the same period in 2021. What do you think is responsible for this shortfall in revenue receipt?
I think you have to look at the collection. Like I mentioned, one area where the government continues to have shortfall has to do with the oil projection for the year. Well, we talked about the Nigerian oil production. Sometime last year, it was as low as below 1 million barrels per day. This definitely will affect the revenue of the government. You know, Nigeria, for a long time, we have been producing below even the OPEC quota that have been given by 1.6 trillion. And so we have been producing. These are some of the issues that the government continues to have when it comes to oil. Then you also look at the collection. There are some debts that we have not been able to collect. So these affect the revenue position of the government. That's why when you look at the current government position in terms of improving our tax processes, that would definitely increase the ability of the government to increase its revenue. Because unless the government will increase its revenue, it will always be faced with these deficit issues. That's why it's a major revenue increase. Increasing the revenue profile of the government is a major task, a major focus of this current administration, which everyone supports.